Hello, Robs. We're back with Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor by Major General Frank Richardson, M.D. Chapter 4, The Spectrum of Sex. The social or medical treatment of homosexuality is outside the scope of this book, but an understanding of the part which sexual maladjustment might have played in the formation of Napoleon's character may be made easier by a few remarks about male sexuality, which need only be very brief, because the subject is so much discussed nowadays. Male and female created he, them, says the Bible, and it is generally assumed that the words imply male or female, but it is possible that the author of Genesis meant exactly what he wrote. The Talmud states Adam and Eve were at first one being. Early Greek statues of a being compounded of Hermes and Aphrodite show that the world has for centuries known about the existence of the so-called hermaphrodites, who are both male and female. True hermaphrodites are rare. Only about 80 cases have been reported in medical literature. But our knowledge of the gradations between male and female bodily development has been greatly enlarged in recent years. Amongst the fortunate majority who have never had reason to doubt that they were completely male or female. They were completely male or female realization has slowly grown that there exists the unhappy few who are aware that they do not fully belong to either sex. The problems are blandly ignored in many medical textbooks, apart from the more specialized ones, but there has been a spate of articles and case records in medical journals from which doctors can get guidance about the handling of such intricate cases. Intricate they are indeed, for sex is not an affair of any single factor in the complex picture, but a matter of the total personality, depending not only upon the genes, the external genital organs, and sex glands or gonads, but also upon the psychological adjustment. An article in a medical journal recently laid down 8 criteria which may be used in determining sex or gender, and described cases in which male and female criteria were present in varying proportions. Absolutely bungling this, but in my defense, I just woke up, so. Including one in which the doctor said that the child was a boy, but the mother disagreed and raised the child as a girl. Difficult medico-legal issues may be raised in such cases, not only concerning the inheritance of titles and property, but social questions including divorce. In the United States, the laws vary in different states. In the United States, the laws vary in different states. This guy's got a clunky style to him, even though I'm butchering it, but it's still. In the United States, the laws vary in different states. And it seems that the law in our own country has not yet defined sex, but still will have to be attempted. And it may not be easy. In a curious divorce case involving a marriage between 2 males, one a transvestite, sick, and the other a transsexualist, the judge, who was also a doctor, said that he was the first English judge ever called on to decide an individual's sex. The Daily Telegraph, 3rd February 1970, having mentioned sex change and in Chapter 2 suggested that Napoleon possibly lived in the ill-defined territory between the sexes, one must say a little about transvestism and transsexualism. One is fairly common, the other quite rare. Transvestism, the desire to wear the clothes of the opposite sex. Cross-dressing is surprisingly common, running second only to homosexuality and the sexual deviation stakes. comparatively rare group of people, mostly men, share with the transvestite. I don't know if that's just the way he spells it, or I thought it had an E at the end. The desire to cross-dress, but go much further because of the intensity of their desire to be accepted as members of the opposite sex. These are the transsexualists who provide the cases of so-called change of sex. The desire to wear all or part of the dress of the other sex leads us to the subject of fetishism, in which sexual feelings are aroused by various objects. The psychologist Wilhelm Steckel tells us that there is not an organ in the human body, not a single article of clothing or of daily use, which may not become the object of fetishism, and that hair and pigtails are preferred objects in the world of the fetishist. The apparently deranged men who cut off girls' pigtails and are found to possess a hoard of these are in the grip of this strange compulsion. In a later chapter, we shall see that Pauline Bonaparte, Napoleon's favorite sister, was a foot fetishist. According to Alfred Adler, the infant who sucks his toes may become a foot fetish. All right, well, that might be taken a little far, buddy. I mean, a baby is a baby. Babies do all kinds of stuff. A baby who might walk off a cliff may be a suicide in future life. Babies don't necessarily follow reason there, for the most part. Fetishism merges into the sphere of erogenous zones, though this is not strictly defined as fetishism. Fetishism is very widespread, and as for erogenous zones, Steckel assures us that every man and every woman has his or her preferred erogenous zones. Unconscious influences from early childhood play a part in this. And in writing of breast and buttock fetishism, psychologists point to the similar rounded smoothness of these areas and the importance of the mother's breast in the infant's early life. Learned discussion of this sexual symbolism has been taken over by the popular press in more colloquial terms, and we read of bosom men and bottom men, the former being the preferred type in the United States, where the idea is a well-filled sweater. In Latin countries, a similarly well-filled pair of slacks must move fast if it is to escape a pinch. Okay. And here, as we shall see, Napoleon seems to have run more or less true to type. Difficulties in adaptation to sex can trouble those whose feet are both firmly planted on one side of the fence, as well as those whose physical equipment is equivocal. In all human beings, there are elements of maleness and of femaleness in varying proportions, and just as genetic influences and variations in male and female hormones combine to produce wide variations of physical types, so do psychological mechanisms of great complexity, working within our minds from conscious or unconscious interpretations of environmental influences in childhood, cause variations in our emotional attitude to sex, which are as many-hued as the rainbow. Hey, this guy actually had something going on here. He foresaw the future, with the strongly heterosexual and the strongly homosexual at opposite ends of the spectrum. I should look into this guy. He's probably part of the Illuminati. He's saying too many key words here that seem to have come to fruition. In 1948, the American psychologist A.C. Kinsey rather startled the world by his findings that at least 4% of white males in the United States are exclusively homosexual, and more than one-third of all males have had some adult homosexual experience. Sometime before the publication of the Kinsey Report, another American psychologist had suggested that the tendency of American parents to encourage their children in courtship or dating at an early age, when our boys are more concerned with football or cricket, springs from a fear of homosexuality, which he believed to be more widespread than was usually supposed. At that time, the studies of Kinsey and his co-workers led them to classify men into 7 groups. From Group 0, the exclusively heterosexual, to Group 6, the exclusively homosexual. Thus, Group 1 is predominantly heterosexual and only incidentally homosexual, and so on. This is a more exact classification calling for more detailed knowledge of the individual than my own simile of the spectrum. Kinsey's reference to men being incidentally homosexual indicates a further aspect of the problem, which is that sexual orientation may vary at different times of an individual's life, not only in the normal process of development, but in accordance with his opportunities for sexual experience at the time. One example being the conditions in prison. Yeah, buddy, we all go to prison, in which can incline a normal male towards. I mean, if he's going to be sexual in prison, he's pretty much confined to what he's going to have there. Male towards homosexual conduct, from which he will turn when his life resumes its usual pattern. Obviously, then, the problem of homosexuality is not concerned only with the effeminate individuals referred to as pansies, often ridiculed on the stage, and of whom robustly heterosexual males might say that they can spot them a mile off. In the world of the homosexual, some play the active and some the passive role. To some extent, this depends upon whether men possess feminine traits or women masculine ones. It seems to be established that actively homosexual men can often, by some sixth sense, recognize potential partners. Opinion is divided about whether homosexual assaults on young children are an important factor in setting them off on the wrong road. One young soldier with whom I had to deal had, like Napoleon's Grand Benet in Egypt, been ill-used by Arabs. But it transpired that he had not been unwilling. What? The trouble was that he had not been paid. He told me that he had, when a schoolboy, been homosexually assaulted by a soldier, but admitted that he had always felt more like a girl than a boy, and he had marked masochistic tendencies. As one doctor wrote, these men have long known of their feminine tendencies, may have had experiences at school, and have had to exert themselves to preserve their chastity. But it is important to realize that although statistics indicate that a desire for homosexual relations exists in a considerable percentage of the population, a far greater number of men, although homosexual to some extent, have no such desires, but may still be troubled by doubts and fears which are often unnecessary, and which may be resolved by seeking medical advice. Homosexuality is, in fact, a form of immaturity, a failure to progress beyond the stage of development at which such feelings are more or less normal, a deviation developing from the autoerotic or narcissistic phase of the child's development. It has been well defined as self-love once removed. Napoleon had tendencies to which the term narcissism could be applied, and his selfishness could almost be called self-love. The immaturity leading to homosexuality may be both emotional and physical, but psychological influences are more potent than the genetic inheritance or the effect of hormones. Obviously, hypogonadism and an effeminate body, such as I have described in Napoleon's case, added to the psychological factors already considered, might be expected to make a man more liable to linger in the immature homosexual phase, and there is, in fact, statistical evidence in support of this supposition. Let's look at the pictures before we infuriate more people with this guy's book, Napoleon at the Military School, 1783. Very narcissistic. What's he doing? What is he up to? General Armand Augustin Louis de Caulaincourt, Duke of Vicenza. General Maximilian Sebastian Count Foy. The death of Marshal Lannes Napoleon at Essling. The effects which this kind of body could have had on the development of Napoleon's character and personality are perfectly outlined in one of the basic tenets of Adler's teachings, his theory of organ inferiority, Minderwertigkeit von Organen, or myodysplasia, which was the seed from which grew his concept of feelings of inferiority and thus eventually the popular, almost too popular, inferiority complex. Adler found that the possession of inferior organs of any sort, any kind of organic deficiency or abnormality, enormously intensifies the normal feeling of weakness, helplessness, or inferiority, which is experienced by every child in its early development. This leads to a deeply felt sense of inferiority and, in the case of a boy, to the development of feminine traits. As a result, there is an intensification of the striving towards an often unattainable goal. Here is how Adler described the psychical development of such children. They wish to surpass all others and to accomplish everything alone, insatiable and lusting after the semblance of power. They demand proofs of love without ever feeling satisfied. Don Juan, Messalina. To the names in brackets, I think he might safely have added Napoleon. If the inferiority is in the external genital organs, and if there is anything about the boy's body which appears to be less than completely masculine, as in Napoleon's case, then, although this may, in Adler's expression, close the extension of his lifeline in the direction of love and marriage, it may also lead to an unconscious exaggeration of all traits which tend to assert his maleness. Again, to quote Adler, the child, with occasional variations, regards the following as masculine: strength, greatness, riches, knowledge, victory, coarseness, cruelty, violence, and activity as such. There are opposites being feminine. He seeks triumph in every human relation. A great deal of Napoleon's character is crystallized here. Amongst the problems which Adler tells us will face these children as they grow up are psychogenic impotence, and the fear of love, marriage, and women, all of which, as I shall show, can be discerned in Napoleon's life story. Mr. Cronin describes Napoleon's interest in the importance of testicles and in the subject of castration, and suggests that because of his very small external genital organs, he had a subconscious fear of castration. In other words, what Freudians call castration anxiety or a castration complex. I have preferred to consider the subject in terms of the teaching of Adler, because this seems to be peculiarly applicable to Napoleon's case, and it is more easily understood by amateur psychologists. Whether we follow Freud or Adler, there are grounds for supposing that Napoleon's hypogonadism helped to cause the coarseness with which he treated women and the strain of cruelty in his nature. An example of his sadism was the treatment which he personally ordered for women camp followers who did not leave the army when told to do so. They were to be smeared over with soot and exposed for 2 hours in the marketplace. His second wife, Marie Louise, knew all about his sadism. She wrote in her diary that she dreaded his anger, but would sooner die than give him the pleasure of witnessing her pain by crying on account of his reproaches. Napoleon's sadism did not confine itself to mere verbal attacks. There is abundant evidence of less subtle, more direct manifestations of this tendency. He simply could not keep his hands off people, and men, women, and children all suffered from his slappings, pinchings, and pulling of ears, noses, and hair. Were it not for countless personal descriptions of such experiences in contemporary memoirs, written by friend or foe, adorers and haters of the great man, this curious habit or foible would be unbelievable. It was something quite separate from his violent rages, such as the ones in which he struck his head groom Jardin across the face with a riding whip and later had to give him 3,000 francs in consolation. It was a habit from which Napoleon derived a curious sensual pleasure, and as he grew more powerful, and the victims could not resist but accepted his assaults with resignation, so did the habit grow upon the emperor until it seemed that he hardly knew he was giving way to it. The emperor's personal servants had to submit to this treatment. Very frequently, daily in fact, as the 17-year-old Mameluke Rustam found after joining the general's entourage in Egypt. He was pinched and slapped until his eyes filled with tears. His successor, the young valet Saint Denis, was to say that the slaps on the back were accompanied by agreeable expressions such as "my son, my boy, my child," and he wrote, "What would one not do for such a master?" Many others almost welcomed the curious treatment with gratification at being noticed at all. Well, you have to agree that being slapped on the back and saying, "my son, my boy," is much better than being fucking slapped across the face. But some people were not so complacent about these assaults, as they could be called in a police court today, if the victims chose to complain. Dr. Halley, for example, protested violently, left the room in indignation, and was thereafter left alone. He probably discerned what lay behind Napoleon's physical assaults, and so in fact did one or two perceptive men who were not doctors. The youthful Marcelin Marbeau realized that the emperor's handling was with him a kind of caress, and in his memoirs he referred to the habit of ear-pinching as the flattering caress which he always employed to persons with whom he was pleased. Constant Wary, the valet with the longest service with Napoleon, realized that it kept his master happy and was therefore worth enduring in the interests of peace and quiet. His evidence is convincing and suggestive. From personal experience, I can affirm that he used to pinch not merely the tip, but the whole of the ear, sometimes catching hold of both of them at once in quite masterly fashion. Sometimes when I came in to dress him, he would rush at me with his favorite greeting of "Hello, you rascal," and pinch both my ears at once and making me scream. Not infrequently he added sundry slaps, adroitly applied, whereupon I was sure to find him excellently good-tempered for the whole day, considerate and charming as he alone could be. By thus emphasizing that the emperor's advances, though painful, were essentially playful, Constant reinforced his empathetic denial that Napoleon used to beat his servants. He said that he knew of only 2 instances of this, and both, in his opinion, were justified. And we're going to leave off there because we're midway through and I won't finish. How many pages do we got, actually? Actually, we'll continue for another page. But for an emperor to beat his servants, even if it was only twice, is not my idea of a well-balanced personality. And I can recall only 2 other leaders who did so, and both, though great, were undoubtedly homosexual. Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great. Don't tell me I have to read these biographies too. Alexander the bisexual and Frederick the bisexual. Josephine's lady's maid, Mademoiselle Averlon, learned, like Constant, to gauge the emperor's good humor by the amount of pain caused by the tweaks and slaps which he bestowed upon the empress and her maids indiscriminately. And she added that he did not realize what pain he caused them. Right. Ladies at court were reduced to tears, their noses made to bleed, and even generals suffered. General Junot's ear was once pulled until it bled, and his hair was pulled so hard that his face was all bloody. I have said that Napoleon loved children, but showed a curious streak of cruelty in his dealings with them. He was strongly attracted to children, and many of them liked him, but they were often victims of his pinches and slaps. He did not spare quite small babies, not even his own adored son, whom the actor Talma was once surprised to find him slapping. What? Repeatedly, because, said Napoleon, it amused him to be spanking a king. His little nephew, Achille Marat, had his ears pulled so hard that he cried, whereupon Napoleon pulled them still harder, and when the child flew into a rage, he dealt him a really heavy blow on the face, which sent him staggering into the arms of a bystander. The boy's mother fainted, and the emperor stalked off with some comment about not spoiling children. I don't spoil 'em, bruv, I bite 'em. Napoleon's friendship with the 14-year-old Betsy Balcombe in St. Helena, which will be described later, was marred by some rather malicious teasing and really painful pulling of her nose and recently pierced ears. Napoleon's entourage must have been quite relieved when his aggression and sadistic impulses were expended upon animals such as Josephine's swan or the hens, sheep, goats, and cows in his garden in St. Helena, at which it amused him to shoot. The curious physical context constantly sought by Napoleon link his sadism with indications of fetishism. The significance of his predilection for noses is considered in discussion of his homosexual leanings. Monsieur Guy Breton, who tells us that shapely rumps set Napoleon's palms itching, is not the only author to hint that Napoleon's interest was aroused by that particular erogenous zone. But he harps on the theme with remarkable persistence. Napoleon, we gather, was a connoisseur of a plump and well-placed rump, and his eyes would follow the waggling behind of some passing beauty. Monsieur Breton depicts Napoleon cheerfully violating court damsels with attractive bottoms, and he even tells us on what authority one is tempted to wonder that the emperor was disappointed when Queen Maria Louisa of Spain did not prove to possess the provoking bust and enticing rump which his imagination had pictured. In his book, Patterns of Psychosexual Infantilism, Wilhelm Steckel writes, many buttocks fetishists become sexually aroused at the mere sight of a well-formed backside. Bisexual men with homosexual tendencies, such as I shall show were present in Napoleon's character, tend to be attracted by girls of a boyish appearance and like to see them in trousers. Napoleon's first mistress habitually wore hussar uniform with elegant white pantaloons. Whether his palms itched or not, he made a curious comment about Josephine when talking to Bertrand in St. Helena. She had the prettiest little backside imaginable, where it could be seen the three islets of Martinique. On it could be seen the three islets of Martinique. Oh, that was the name of her home in Martinique. Les Trois Islets. Let the Freudians make what they can of that little joke. Was it merely rather undignified for an emperor to make such a point of the attractiveness of his first empresses behind, and this was not the only occasion on which he spoke of it, or could it have some deeper significance? Isn't the old saying sometimes a cigar is a cigar? Maybe he just liked her butt. Monsieur Breton does not follow the story as far as Napoleon's second marriage, so we may never learn what the emperor thought of Marie Louise's anatomy. Among sexual neurotics or persons of weak sexuality, aggression sometimes takes symbolic forms, such as the cutting off of women's hair, throwing ink on their clothes, or otherwise defiling them, openly or surreptitiously. Instances of this sort of curious conduct occurred at the outset of three of Napoleon's affairs with mistresses. At his first meeting with Pauline Forez, he deliberately upset a cup of coffee over her dress. And exactly the same thing happened some 7 years later to Eleanor Denuel when he first met Mademoiselle Georges. He tore off her veil and trampled it upon. Okay. There may be. Who the hell's going to go with this guy after he tears her veil off and just stomps it? Now I sound like I'm from fucking Boston. There may be perfectly simple explanations for these acts. The spilled coffee may have been a device to get acquainted with Pauline, who was sent to change her dress in Napoleon's room. Napoleon, No such sequel to the mishap in Eleanor's case is mentioned by Hector Fleischmann, who ascribes the incident to a piece of clumsiness. The destruction of Mademoiselle George's veil could have been intended or demonstrate that Napoleon meant to supplant her elderly Polish protector, Prince Sapaya, who had given her the veil. But these inelegant preludes to courtship could have been unconscious design to assert the virility of which he had secret doubts, or it could have been he was trying to pinch her ears and missed. All right, we're going to stop here now.